I have followed various opportunities that presented themselves, and that's been really interesting. At various points in my life, I thought, I'll go back into universities, I'll become an academic, I'll teach. Sort of did that in casual and part-time roles, but the opportunities at that particular moment were in arts organisations, and the opportunity to work with artists, which is really quite exciting, and so I took those, and then one thing kind of led to another, as it does.
Welcome to a new journey. I'm your host, Matt Griffith, with a slightly dodgy voice after suffering from a cold for the past 2 weeks, so apologies if I do start coughing. With me today is Blair French, the CEO of the Murray Art Museum. Mama, welcome to the journey.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
As I said, my voice may give out halfway through, so if I do start coughing, you just pad for time. Blair will be right.
I'll do my best.
Now, we always start by talking about the connection to the local area. And most people, not all, but most people have some connection from childhood, for example, or family. That's not the case for yourself, though, is it?
It's not. No, I'm new to the Murray region. I have been here just over 12 months. That said, I came here to run Murray Art Museum Albury, and it's a museum that I had connections with in the past. So my connections to the region had been visiting Mama for work reasons down the years. Yeah.
So you started in 2024, and we are going to work our way towards that and your experience living here and what you enjoy about the border. But let's start with the childhood then. A child of the city?
Technically, yes, but a child of a regional city in New Zealand. So I was actually born in the Cook Islands, but my parents are Pākehā New Zealanders. I was largely raised in the Waikato in the city of Hamilton, Kirikiriroa.
Yes.
So an inland regional river city, so some connections, some familiarities, I guess.
Yeah. Is Hamilton north or south of
North. So it is about 120 k's south of Auckland, sort of over the hills into the big dairy farming basin.
Yeah. And you went to school there? Or?
Largely went to school there. There was a small-ish university there. My father was an academic there. We had occasional periods in other places, in Manchester in the UK, in Melbourne, while he was doing sabbaticals and study and research. But yeah, I largely grew up, did all of my school years otherwise in Hamilton.
Yeah, did you gravitate towards the arts early on?
Not really, actually. No.
Rugby union?
Of course. Big sort of sporting background in my mother's family, so that was just a big part of the region we grew up in. Very interested in writing and journalism, and actually when I left school, that was probably where I thought I was going. I was interested in literature. I'd always had this fascination with journalism. I sort of thought that was where I would go, and the interest in arts beyond the writing really just started very late in high school.
Oh, interesting.
So I never actually studied art at school or at art school or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, what made you? A lot of the people that I talk to, that it really was embedded quite early on, and they just kind of naturally gravitated towards it. So what kind of opened your eyes to the arts?
I think a few things. In my final year at high school, there was a new course called Art History offered. We had an interesting system back then where you could qualify, you get your university qualifications in what would be year 11 here, and your year 12 was sort of an add-on. If you wanted to do medicine or law or something serious, you had to do very well. But otherwise, it was a little bit of a time for exploration. The school offered art history. I thought that might be a fun thing to do. But probably more importantly, I had an amazing history teacher in my final year at high school who really instilled in a very small group of us doing history the importance of, or the possibility of studying local history, understanding the place in which we grew up and lived more deeply. And in a way, as I started to study art history, which was Renaissance European art history, but just started to think about art, and we were introduced to art a little bit through the history course as a means of really beginning to understand through different ways of looking the place in which you lived. So when I went away to university, I kept doing art history, but I was really focusing, trying to get towards New Zealand art history, and I was studying New Zealand literature, and so those things kind of coalesced a bit.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's so broad, just saying into the arts. I mean, it doesn't really say anything because it is so broad.
They are, yeah. There's so many different strands.
Yeah. So and the kind of thing that attracts people towards it can be very different as well. You know, so for you it was kind of grounded in history.
It was grounded in understanding place. It wasn't necessarily all about history, understanding the place of today, starting to read New Zealand writers of the moment, starting to look at art. There wasn't a lot of, galleries or public art opportunities in the city in Hamilton when I grew up, but they did open a big new public art museum towards the end of my high school years, and that was also something, just a place to go, and started to also spark some of that interest.
Yeah. So specifically when we talk about yourself in relation to art, are we talking about painting? Are we talking about photographs? Are we? What area are we?
In a way, the whole range. At different points in my career, I guess I've spent some time specialising in different areas. Some of that's circumstance, some of it's you find yourself being offered work in an organisation that has a particular focus, or there's an opportunity to do something there in a particular area. So it's really wide. At different points, yes, photography's been a very strong part of my background. I wrote my PhD in photography. I was a curator and for a while acting director of the Australian Centre for Photography. I've written a couple of books on Australian photography. So photography is a strong part. But I've also had moments where I've concentrated on painting, concentrated on performance art, just because those were interesting at the moment, or the organisations I worked in were provided the platform for those areas of activity.
Yeah. So once you started to kind of dip your toes in the water of the arts, where to from there?
Well, university. I went away to Canterbury, to University of Canterbury in Christchurch, studying English and art history. And probably still had a stronger interest in writing and in possibly still journalism. And in my second year, I just thought I wanted to get involved in some things, and I decided that I really wanted to try and get involved in a student newspaper. Mm-hmm. I was desperately nervous about knocking on the door and putting my hand up, but I did. And it was a very interesting sort of environment, very politically active, very smart people on campus who wrote for the paper. And the two editors said to me, well, what are you studying? I said, well, English. And they just looked at me. I guess everyone they'd ever met at the newspaper probably studied English. And I said, art history. And they said, oh, great. We need someone to write a review of this exhibition. And they gave me a card for an exhibition, like an opening. Said, can you give us 500 words by Friday? I had no idea what I was doing. Absolutely none. But I did it, and it was actually through writing about art in that context more than art history that led me down the path.
Yeah. And then obviously you left New Zealand and moved to Australia. Was
a few things in between.
Australia,
no. I started my curatorial career in New Zealand as a trainee at the National Art Gallery, and I then spent a few years working in the UK. Went back to New Zealand, was teaching at university, just in a sort of part-time role, and decided I wanted to do postgraduate study. It was time to do that. And I'd almost enrolled to do that at Auckland University, and the professor there, who I knew quite well from my work in the art scene, sort of sat me down one day and he said, look, before we sign the dotted line, so to speak, do you think this is a good idea? It's a small country. I know you know me. What are you going to get out of this working relationship? Why don't you set your sights somewhere else and take a bit of a punt? And so I ended up at University of Sydney, sort of on the back of that, really.
Yeah. And you said you spent a little bit of time in Manchester?
In Manchester. I did a little high school time in Manchester, and then I went back there in the early 90s.
Yeah. I mean, just having a look at your resume and your prior roles, I mean, it doesn't look to me like you've planned and plotted every step of the way. It sounds like you really haven't had an overarching plan necessarily.
No, I have followed various opportunities that presented themselves, and that's been really interesting. At various points in my life, I thought, I'll go back into universities, I'll become an academic, I'll teach. Sort of did that in casual and part-time roles, but the opportunities at that particular moment were in arts organisations and the opportunity to work with artists, which is really quite exciting. And so I took those, and then one thing kind of led to another, as it does.
Yeah. Has it been a satisfying career because of that? A lot of people would find maybe a little bit anxious about dipping into different roles, and they like the kind of routine and the surety of a single job. How have you found the experience?
Both exciting and sometimes a little nerve-wracking, but also in part, I should say, quite deliberate on my part, largely because a lot of I haven't worked in big state institutions or national institutions, other than starting in one in New Zealand, and that was really quite small. So it's been about working in quite small organisations that are quite dynamic, quite nimble. You tend to give your heart and soul and life to them. But also they're organisations that I personally believe need refreshing in a constant way. Like, I don't think it's great to stay at a lot of these places too long.
Yes.
Actually, if they're going to be culturally dynamic and responsive. And when I went to take over the executive director role at ArtSpace, which is quite a small contemporary art organisation, I think I had about 4 staff to begin with, had about 9 when I left. My wife and I had a conversation about, this is the job I'd really wanted, this was going to be a great job. We sort of talked about, when I get to 7 years, if I'm still there, and I'm having a great time, could she tap me on the shoulder and remind me that I don't think it's a good idea to be there for 10, either for me or the organisation. Got to 7 years, I was having a great time. She didn't need to tap me on the shoulder. I became quite conscious of it, that the organisation could probably do with a refresh, and maybe so could I.
Yeah, and it is again. I don't want to talk for everyone, etc., etc. And I'm not completely ignorant, but at the same time, I don't know it intimately. But I would imagine that having such a broad experience, that is what people in the art space would be looking at, wouldn't they? If you work in the same role for 10,
I think in big
years.
institutions, I think there's a place for that. Absolutely, you can grow and move within the institution. And in a way, institutions and organisations are just ways of people working together. That's basically what they are. And some of them, by dint of their scale and their financial responsibilities or their political responsibilities, they need that to be quite stable. But in other arts organisations, the more dynamic and the more able to be fluid and move in relationship to what's happening in the world around them, the better.
Yeah. Now, let me read out a few of these from your resume. I hope they're all right. It was a copy and paste.
I'm a bit worried about this.
I put a lot of faith into Director, Curatorial and Digital at the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia, Executive Director, ArtSpace Visual Arts Centre, Associate Director, Performance Space, and Program Manager and Acting Director at the Australian Centre for Photography. Do you regret leaving any of those? Do you look back and go...
No, I don't. I left them all for the right reasons at the time. And I think my career and just who I am and grew from doing so. I think in most cases probably that was good for the organisation. There was a specific reasoning. Often, in most cases, there was an opportunity. It was actually something else offered itself rather than just leaving in those cases. I miss some of them. I go back to, one of them doesn't exist anymore, but I go back to those organisations as a visitor and sometimes as a working partner. And it's like, this is great. That's right. I really loved it here. This is a good group of people. Some people are still there, etc. But it was the right thing to do to move.
You mentioned the word opportunity. Is it almost addictive to take advantage of opportunity, and once you've started it a few times? Because I imagine a lot of people are so scared, like they're risk averse of taking an opportunity, and so almost withdraw to what they know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, it's usually frightening to a certain extent, and that doesn't change the more you do it. In fact, sometimes I sort of feel that perhaps it gets a little harder as you get older, in a way. Yeah. When you're younger, I should say, I'll do this, and then something else will happen. I'll do that, and something. You have a kind of confidence, or at least we did back then. I don't know whether young people would have that same thing today, particularly, professionally, and the arts are under pressure. Maybe that's not the case. But I mean, one of the things I've always tried to do, and I guess I'd sort of say this is why I mark for myself whether there's been a success in a role, is leave an organisation and that group of people in a better place than when I arrived. So it's not just to use it to do something, it's to build it.
Yes, yeah. Now, you mentioned your wife.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these roles, are they mainly in Sydney?
Those are all in Sydney, yes.
Yeah. But, I mean, you have moved around, obviously, and now you're in Albury-Wodonga. So what's the impact been like on your family? Talk to me a little bit about that.
That's an interesting one too. So, yes, most of those, all those roles you've read out, and there was another one after the MCA before I came here. We're all in Sydney. They're all, a couple of those I could walk to work. I mean, it's a big city, but those organisations are reasonably clustered together. So it's quite a tight sort of place that I've worked from 96 through until last year. So quite a tight community. My wife's quite involved in that community. She's an artist. The impact on her, partly, I don't know if it's great to have a museum director / curator as a partner when you're an artist. So every time I've moved to an organisation, she obviously can't do anything there. She can't show there. She can't be collected by it. So there's been that impact as we have moved around. And I think we have one child. I think for him growing up in that environment, I'd like to think was quite stimulating. He was very involved in that. It brought him kind of opportunities in a way, in a couple of those jobs at ArtSpace in particular. And then also at the MCA, I travelled a lot, particularly when I was at ArtSpace. And there are occasions when he would come or the family would come. So he got to see, got to come to museum openings in Korea where I was speaking at, and be taken out to dinner by these sort of formal scenarios, which were 11, 12, 13-year-old, I think. Might have been, I think he took it in stride. He seemed to quite enjoy it. So I think those kind of opportunities, went to New York, he went to Canada on work trips, he went to France, he went to the UK. Maybe there's a little bit of a sense of tagging along, but we worked something out, particularly as he became a young teenager, because he was football. I won't say obsessed, he was a big football fan. So as long as we could...
When you say football...
I mean the round ball game in his case.
Yes.
And in mine, I enjoy that game too. So, as long as we could take a weekend football match in whatever country we were on, he would tolerate the other thing. So I think, there were impacts, but I think also, valuable experiences. Yeah.
And is he involved in the art space?
He's just finished a graphic design diploma, so we'll see.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, let's talk about Mama specifically. So how did this role come about?
So Mama came into being on the back of the Regional Art Gallery in, 9.5 years ago now, so 2015. I first came to Albury actually at the invitation of Audrey Banfield, who was director of the Regional Art Gallery, sort of 20-odd years ago, 22 years ago, I think, to talk and open a show and do things. So I had a bit of a connection. When I was at the Museum of Contemporary Art, we had a few shows that came here. I came down to open one of those. So I was very aware of the museum, very conscious of its work, has an incredible reputation.
So even in Sydney...
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely one of, if not the most interesting sort of dynamic art museums in regional Australia. So always really, really interested. The role came up, I knew the previous director, Brie Pickering, reasonably well and knew the sort of work that she'd been doing here. I had stepped out of my last role in Sydney, which was CEO of Carriageworks. And as I sort of mentioned before, all these organisations in Sydney, you can kind of throw a blanket over. It's like, well, I really do want to try something a little bit different. Perhaps a different community, a different sort of setting, different interests and obligations within the museum, just a different place to work. And maybe also understand, I've lived in Australia for half my life, but that's all been in Sydney. Now, yes, I've moved around, etc., but I must have an incredibly Sydney-determined view of this country. However much I want to push against that, I must have.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to try something a little bit different, really.
What surprised you the most about living regionally?
I don't think there have been any big surprises,
so
actually.
It was as you...
I don't know what I imagined, but nothing has sort of made me sort of stand up and go, oh.
Yeah.
I mean, I I've got a lot of learning to do about what really drives community interests and needs, and so that's a lot of listening to do. But there's nothing that's come out of that which has really made me think, oh, this is far more. It's far more complicated than what I thought it might be. I mean, it is. It's a complex place, of course, but I think I assumed that, and I think I do hark back to where I grew up. I mean, there are real similarities in a way between the two cities.
Yeah. How many people live in Hamilton?
Well, I'm not sure what it is now. It's grown significantly. It would just hit 100,000 when I lived there in the 80s. So Albury-Wodonga, it's a similar kind of model. Yeah.
But of course, back then it was more. Well, Hamilton is fairly close to Auckland, you were saying, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there's an isolation aspect that has been completely removed because of the connectivity around the internet, I feel. And I was brought up in the city, so I was born in Manchester, actually, in the UK.
Oh, there we go.
But grew up in Adelaide,
right,
and then lived in the cities. I lived in Sydney and Brisbane. But back in the day before the internet, I mean, the isolation aspect was a factor in regional Australia, but that has completely disappeared now. I mean, you can live and work anywhere, really. Well, what do you miss about Sydney?
I don't miss very much. I go back a lot still, so I guess I'm still, the friendships I have there, the connections to the art world, I still have. They're still there. What I don't have is the sort of long, quiet times in the city, so I'm actually quite busy in a way when I'm there compared to what I used to be previously. That thing about what is just your experience of a place when you're completely off. I just spent a couple of weeks up there for Christmas, and that was really good in the sense of just being completely off and spending time with family and just enjoying Sydney for what it is. I don't miss the humidity. I'm quite happy not to be living in that. And that was really interesting when I first came here end of January last year, and the first time I went back 3 or 4 weeks later to Sydney, and just stepping off the plane onto the tarmac and went, oh, that's right.
Yeah, this is what dry heat's
like. This
yeah.
is so much nicer here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you enjoy the most other than the weather? What do you actually enjoy the most about living here?
I enjoy the opportunity that presents itself to just be a bit quieter and to think and just be a little less hectic. In the most simple ways. I like to walk. I walk a lot. I do that in Sydney as well. I do notice here I'm not bumping into people on the footpath or having to pay attention to external things. So I like that quietness, and I did want a sort of opportunity to maybe just be a bit more, I don't really like these words, but a bit more mindful, a bit more thoughtful, a bit more, just a little bit of time for myself.
Yeah.
Work's very busy. I don't have a lot of time, but it feels that the time I do have is just that little bit calmer.
Yeah. Now, of course, living here, we're lucky to be right on the highway, but as I'm sure you've now kind of realised, is that we are more Melbourne-centric than we are Sydney. Obviously, there's no question about that. It's only 3 hours down the road to Melbourne. Have you become more involved in the Melbourne art scene since being here?
No, I haven't. And actually, that should be my answer to your previous question. Yes, the Melbourne or the Victorian focus of the city or feel of the city, I hadn't really expected. No, because I still have my family back in Sydney. I go back quite a bit to see them and do other things. So I haven't had as much time as I'd like. I know there's this big Melbourne-Sydney divide that everyone talks about, and the art world has its particular take on that. And it's probably true to an extent, but actually I spent a lot of time in Melbourne, or enough, anyway. I spent no more time there last year than I had previously, which is probably missing an opportunity. Just been down there this weekend. Oh, that's right, you can just jump on the train. It's really pleasant and calm and easy to do. So no, not really. And it's interesting because I'm not sure. I still think that perhaps Mama has got a stronger presence in the consciousness of the Sydney art world and the Melbourne art world. It could be that most people who have come to Mama to work from elsewhere in the arts have actually tended to come from Sydney. Maybe we need to, just be a little bit. I think we are conscious of that and just making sure that our Melbourne connections, but also just our Victorian connections, our regional Victorian connections, are just as strong.
What do you take detailed kind of statistics about the people who go to Mama? Or?
We haven't done that for a little while. We do a daily report, which is just a sort of qualitative, anecdotal, front of house recording conversations.
Yeah.
Checking with people where they're from, but not everyone that comes in the door. Having conversations about what they've enjoyed or not enjoyed, or their thoughts about the museum are. And yes, we do get a lot of people travelling through.
Yeah. And from Wodonga as well, or is it mainly an Albury focus in terms of the number of people?
Don't have really any strong sense of that. A lot from northeast Victoria, more broadly.
Yes.
So we're more likely to have people sort of enter into a conversation and sort of talk about having come from down from Yakandanda or Bright or somewhere for the day to do something, and they've come into the museum as well.
That's a good question, actually. That leads me to asking you this: Do the people that live here, do we take advantage of Mama enough?
Some do, and some would really like to encourage to do more of. And it's really, it's also a case for us about how we listen to what the community's really after. We do a lot. Our schools program is really built up, for example, but that schools program extends beyond Albury City, which is great. I mean, kids are great advocates to bring families back, so we've been really working at that. But I think there's a lot more we could do about just some of the perceptions around what an art museum is. And I think every place I've worked at, there's always been a degree of challenge or struggle around little things. Like we did some consultation last year amongst the community, and some young people were saying, well, we'd come if it was free. I was like, well, it is free. We shout it from the rooftops that it's free, but obviously we're not. There's a perception there that we're not breaking down. Or that it's not a place for young people, but in fact we go out of our way to make it that. So what are we not? And that's not communicating very effectively. And maybe that's just simply that art museums have a kind of thinking around them, historically speaking, about places for the elite or places to be quiet and contemplate and don't ask questions and don't socialise. And in the last number of decades, art museums have been working against that. And in fact, some people would say some museums have gone too far the other way, where they become sort of event halls and social spaces more than they are spaces for art. There's a really good balance you can strike, and we need to work at that. Right down to our visibility on the front street, on Dean Street. It's not, you can walk past it and miss it. I understand that. Just little things that we need to work at.
Yeah. Is it harder running an art museum in the digital age because artworks are so accessible just at home on the internet? You don't have to experience something in person, or
possibly. I don't know whether what the way in which people consume imagery all the time on the internet or on your phone, whether there's much of a conflation with what they think an art museum might be, what they're going to get there. But it is really important to be conscious of that. Part of my portfolio at the Museum of Contemporary Art was director of digital. And we worked very hard at this sort of model of what a digital museum looked like. And for us it was, what's the digital engagement with somebody before they come to the museum that helps them come? What's the digital engagement when they're in a museum, because people are not putting their phones away? So how do we actually harness that to augment what's occurring in the museum? Then what's the digital experience for that person after they've gone home? And then the fourth piece is, what's the digital experience of a person that's never going to come to the museum?
Yeah,
physically.
Yes.
For access issues, for living in remote Australia, for whatever. How do we still create an experience of art and all that it kind of brings around thinking about culture and community to across all those sort of moments of contact?
Now we know a city. A regional city like Albury, it's there's so many different elements that are important, from swimming pools. As we've heard, that's been a major issue of late. Sporting grounds, education establishments. What happens? So, if Mama just disappeared tomorrow, what would be the negative impact? And I know I'm focusing on that from a negative. It should be a positive, really. It should be wise. It's so wonderful. But just if it literally wasn't here tomorrow, what would be the negative impact in our community?
Well, I think you look through it. You would look at it through a range of lenses. So one obvious one is the economic lens. We are a tourism driver, and cultural tourism in this region is particularly strong. It's one of the strongest regions in New South Wales for cultural tourism, and Mama is basically the number one leading driver in that. So that goes out the window, along with the kind of jobs and incomes that we provide to a significant number of creative people in the region, whether they work for us, whether they teach in our teaching programs, whether they exhibit with us, whether we collect their work and pay them for the work, whether their work as craftspeople and makers of sorts and artists is in our store. So that's one really obvious one. I think the bigger one is the civic issue. What does an art museum enable? How does an art museum enable a community to come together, to think about itself, to see itself reflected in a way, and to talk back to the culture? I mean, because a lot of the work we do is with artists of the region, or artists who are, even if they're coming from outside, are making work specifically for our museum and for our community. So there's a big loss of there's a sort of hole at the civic heart of a place. There's a big educational piece. Over 3,000 students through our schools program last year coming on site in direct learning experiences, and we are that conduit for them to really engage with ideas around creativity and culture, and not just in art. I mean, art is a great space or a great tool to teach into civics and history and a whole range of programs, Indigenous studies, if you like. I mean, there's a lot of work that we do around First Nations art and thinking about what that means to understanding the history and the future of this place. So all that goes.
Do you get up every day inspired and feeling gung-ho about getting into the museum? And
I love being in the museum.
What does your day-to-day look like?
Dispel all the thoughts about this being hugely exciting. A lot of my day-to-day is management. A lot of my day-to-day is bureaucracy. That's altered in different roles and different types of organisations, but the governance of arts organisations is incredibly important, that they're strong, secure, financially stable. It's a precarious world for the arts, and so that's a strong part of my work. And working with and doing my best in a way to care for people is a critical part of the role, and always has been in these roles. Many years ago, when I was having a little moment of, do I want to go back to being an art writer, an art curator, or do I really want to run organisations? And I was on the steps of the MCA long before I worked there, talking with a colleague who is a pretty eminent art critic from Singapore, who I knew quite well, who had just taken on running an organisation. We had a long conversation, and he talked to me, and it's really stuck in my mind, about how building secure but dynamic and nimble and responsive arts organisations is a piece of creative cultural work. And I guess I was doing the, do I want to be a bureaucrat sort of mindset, but that's not what we're talking about. There might be bureaucracy, that's the means to the end. This is an important creative practice within a culture. Yeah. And so that idea of always trying to leave an organisation in a better place is actually a kind of creative one, and that does get me up and excited.
Yeah. But management in and of itself is such a skill set, isn't it? And I mean, you could apply that in any different area, but that is a very distinctive skill
and you tend to learn on the job in the arts a little, but that's changing. There's a lot more in the way of courses, and there are curatorial and arts management courses the world over now, and that's not a bad thing at all. I unfortunately am old enough that they really didn't exist when I came through, or very few of them did. And I learnt on the job. I had a traineeship. It was more of an apprentice model on a sort of minimum wage, and learning on the job. But you get to a certain point and you go into I was on a company directors course a couple of weeks ago, and go into these courses without the kind of MBA background, a lot of these people that you're sitting there with, executives from ASX listed companies, and you realise you don't know necessarily as much as them, but you've had to do hands-on work across all the areas of an organisation, from finance to HR to governance, that they haven't. And so you have a different understanding. They've got people that do that. We don't have other people.
Yes.
We have to do it ourselves. Yeah. And you make some mistakes. And hopefully you have good people around you on your boards or in councils or state government who you're working for that help you.
So you're not removed from the art to such an extent that you're feeling like you're more of a manager than you are an artist.
No. You, I think you have to work hard to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I would say probably my time at Carriage Works was the most where I got a bit removed from that. But that was an organisation that wasn't solely arts focused. So I could, in these types of roles, no, you need to do the sort of holistic. All these things connect.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people, is that old kind of cliche, I guess, about those that can't do it, can manage it. Are you a good artist yourself? I haven't even asked you this question.
No, and I've got no interest in being an artist. And I know, so I never went. I never even did art at high school.
Yeah.
Certainly didn't do it at university. My practice was as an arts writer, and I guess part of that's creative, part of that's academic, however you want to think about it. But it is a mode of sort of on-the-job training that is about learning to really look hard and think hard and try and take on the intentions and the desires and the aspirations of artists, but also bring hopefully some other perspective to that. So, and I still maintain less and less in terms of time, but a little bit of a writing practice. But no, I have no, and it does mean there are gaps. That does mean that if I'm, I have to spend time with a painter, for example, to really understand what they do, because I don't paint, so I don't necessarily understand the steps and the material knowledge that they're bringing to bear into a work.
Yeah, that's fascinating. All right, okay. Now, one question I always ask is about the next 5 years. Now, you were mentioning 7 years as the time.
I've set that up for myself now, haven't I? Oh dear.
So 5 years brings us to 6 years being in the job. If you were here for five more years, do you expect to be here for a reasonable period of time?
Yeah, I do. I have no expectation what that is. I've learnt, having said what I said earlier, I mean, that 7 years was very specifically for that type of organisation. As long as I'm contributing and not getting in the way of what the museum's next stage would be. But I think at the moment there's a sort of, we're about to turn 10 years old. There's a really interesting opportunity for the development of Mama. We've just announced a new program for the next 15 months, which is a different way of programming. It brings a great focus on artists of the region for the next 5 or 6 months, a great focus on our collection, which in a way is the other creative asset of the region that we have this custodianship over. So I really want to focus on those things and then see where that sets the museum. But I think there's great opportunity. And although I've moved, I always see myself as somebody who wants to instigate something new to help build an organisation. I'm not a crash and burn sort of person. I have once in my career had to make the decision to leave a role earlier than I thought, because, that was the role I took on just before COVID. So the organisation did do a bit of a crash and burn, and I needed to reboot it. So instead of becoming the sort of solid building something, I became the fix-it person. And sometimes in those fix-it roles, you have to acknowledge that once you've fixed it, you then have to hand it over. You've taken on a certain persona, a certain identity within the organisation and outside into the world. You've done your job, pass it on. So that's the one time where I sort of didn't meet my own expectation of how long I'd be somewhere and what I would be able to achieve.
Yeah. So really it's been, because you used the word again a few times there, opportunity. So really it's been a life of opportunity, and kind of as we finish up our chat here, has it been so far a life well led in terms of an opportunity life? Would you as a young Blair be very happy with where you?
But I wouldn't have expected to be here. Never expected to live in Australia, for example. Took an opportunity to come over here. It turned out to be really wonderful. One thing led to another, including meeting my wife, and just some really great job opportunities, and here we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no regrets about that whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, it's been a wonderful chat. We always end just with a few very quick questions. Are you a sweet or savoury?
Oh, both.
Yeah, both. I'm the same. If you had to recommend, if someone was coming from Sydney, and you had to recommend a few things to do here, what would you say, outside of Mama, obviously?
Oh, that was, I was just going to talk about Mama. Look, I'm still learning about the place. So I mentioned earlier, I'm an advocate for walking. So, obviously, I always do direct people to the river. It's such an important, it's, the lifeblood, heart and soul of the place. But I really enjoy just walking around town, all over town. First thing I did before I got appointed was spend a week in here just walking, trying to think, where do I want to live? But also, what is this place? You get a feel from the types of housing and how that changes from area of town, the gardens, the whole thing. So I do encourage, I have done this a bit recently, people to leave their car and just go for a long walk and look and maybe say hello to a few people.
Yeah. God forbid. Actually talking to people, that's crazy. Finally, and this should be a good one, I've got high expectations here. Have you got any good recommendations for us in terms of something we can digest that's not food, as in reading, watching, listening to?
Well, I've just finished a book of poems by called Garamara by Gathering by Wiradjuri writer Janine Lane, who's about to do big work at Mama, so they'll get my Mama plug in, but it's a really important, beautiful book of work about place and country. And then on the other side of things, since we talked about it earlier, briefly, I've also just watched this sporting doc called Unleash the Taniwha. Classic sort of follow a sports team through a season, but it's about the Chiefs in Waikato and Hamilton. And I learned a lot about how that culture how that club was connecting to river and to history and to place. And it was also kind of interesting because it gave absolutely equal weight to Chiefs Manawa, the women's team, and the men's team. I thought that's the first time I'd seen that in one of those sporting docs. So there we go. That's a little touch of where I come from.
Is that what streaming service is that on?
Stan.
It's on Stan.
Yeah.
There we go. Wonderful recommendation. Blair French, CEO of Mama in Albury. Thank you so much for sharing your journey. It's been absolutely fascinating. Great chat. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.